Um, so we're going to be discussing after we've done all the presentations. So the next presenter will be Ted Richthofen. And as I was asking Ted to provide me with a bio of himself, he sent me this equally informative and hilarious text that I'm just going to read out for you and then hand over to Ted. Ted Richthofen is a lecturer at the University of Tübingen and Bonn and academic staff and PhD candidate at the University of Bonn. His research interests include American vice history, so alcohol, drugs, sex work, gambling, organized crime, and prohibition, queer and gender studies, masculinity and trans-masculinity, feminism, immigration, extractive labor and industries in the American West and the working class. He was born in Las Vegas, Nevada, and grew up mostly in Denver, Colorado. His entire family is from the Western US. Ted received his BA in American History from Metropolitan State University of Denver. He received the 2019 Colorado Emerging Historians Award from the State Historian Council and contributes regularly to the Colorado Encyclopedia. Ted says he chose to get his master's degrees in American Studies at Uni Tübingen and now his PhD in Bonn, Germany, to broaden his horizons, get an international perspective, and to get health insurance. He lives in Bonn with his life partner and the little weenie dog and spends most of his time hiking and biking everywhere when he's not teaching, researching, and answering emails. Ted is also a lover of horror, the paranormal, and cemeteries. So after that introduction, I'm very excited to hear you talk, Ted. So over to you.
Hi, thank you so much for that introduction. I'm going to share my screen really fast. Right, and then make it full screen. Can everybody see that? Awesome. All right, so a little more about my field. This presentation is going to be about queer studies, and this is actually a newer field for me as I'm more into history and specifically gender history, but these coincide with each other. And so as a trans-masculine person and a baby academic, I'm very hyper aware of contemporary uproars and anti-trans sentiments. And so I feel further, I guess, called to the academic side of this argument, and not only to justify my own existence, but to continue to deconstruct, right, these social constructions that we have and these hierarchies that we work within. And through my work in cultural studies in Germany, I've become very hyper aware of social constructivism and how it's inseparable from most of our daily interactions. And so without further ado, here is my little presentation I have. So to begin, I want to just give some context that trans people have only recently been able to speak for ourselves. There has been lots of queer studies done about trans people in history. However, sometimes they're often lumped into gay or lesbian categories, which I find rather rigid, and recent trans historians, for example, have contested this claim. I want to also say that my abstract is quite dense and I can't, in the time given, get to everything, but I hope this will be a nice little overview for everyone. This work, much like the work of other trans academics, hopes to collectivize the trans experience and place us within larger social and historical contexts and communities within the United States, and give context to the complex history of race and gender within our history. Much historical work has been done in the last few decades that shows that transgender activity has been found across a variety of cultures and across all of history. The acceptability of trans culture and strictness of binary gender, like most things in the United States, because that's my field, does have a distinctly racial and class-based history. So what is trans and what am I specifically talking about? So one of my favorite trans historians, Susan Stryker, calls trans, or trans people, people who cross over or trans the boundaries constructed by their culture to define and contain that gender. It is the movement across a socially imposed boundary away from an unchosen starting point, a starting place. The history of policing of gender in US history is not about who belongs in what clothing, but who belongs in public space and in life in the US, whose body belongs in the hegemonic power structure, and who belongs in the restrictive and historically contested categories of male and female. In short, the history of trans-masculine people in the US is a study into the history of citizenship. And a little disclaimer, I don't want to exclude trans women from this story. That is also vitally important to understand the whole picture of trans history. But as a trans man, I wanted to narrow in a little bit for this conference. In this presentation, I speak about trans men, and what I mean by this is men who inhabited female-sexed bodies or who were assigned female at birth in their time. They were not simply what we would call cross-dressers or who donned male attire for fun or for entertainment purposes or for limited periods of time, but they lived their entire lives as men. They inhabited male social and civic roles, and even after being outed, possibly, they continued to live as men. So even though the term trans is a modern term, it is clear, to me at least, that trans men have existed before they have been culturally or medically identified. There is evidence that from the earliest inhabitants in the US continent, through colonization, Western expansion, genocide, through the urban industrial booms, post-Civil War Reconstruction, and through the 20th century until present moment, trans men, or men who were assigned female at birth, have lived fully as men and identified as men, and did not fall into categories of lesbian or seeking disguises for socioeconomic reasons. There have been arguments that trans men are simply seeking male privilege, and I think this really simplifies deeply, it just simplifies a much larger topic here. Prior scholars, not transgender themselves, assume that these behaviors follow certain prescribed cycles in history, like first wave feminism. But we can clearly see that female to male identities exist at many given points in history, regardless of when cisgender heteronormative Americans recognized their existence or defined them as non-normative. The ways in which trans male communities thrived or were punished in the United States was based on distinctly racial and class-based hierarchical lines that came into sharp focus in the years surrounding the turn of the 20th century. So to understand trans masculinity, we first have to understand masculinity in this historical context. Gail Bederman, the author of Manliness and Civilization, A Cultural History of Gender and Race in the United States, which I highly recommend reading, claims and argues that masculinity is a continual dynamic process. Through that process, men claim certain kinds of authority based on their particular type of bodies. At any time in history, many contradictory ideas about manhood are available to explain what men are, how they ought to behave, and what sorts of powers and authorities they may claim as men. Part of the way that gender functions is to hide these contradictions and to camouflage the fact that gender is dynamic and always changing. Instead, as she says, gender has been constructed as a fact of nature, and manhood is assumed to be an unchanging transhistorical essence consisting of fixed, naturally occurring traits. The ideological process of gender, whether manhood or womanhood, works through a complex political technology composed of a variety of institutions, ideas, and daily practices. Combined, these processes produce a set of truths about who an individual is, what he or she can do based upon his or her body. Individuals are positioned through that process of gender, whether they choose to be or not. So contemporary research has shown that there has been an ebb and flow of acceptance, specifically of trans-masculine bodies and cross-dressing throughout American history, but that the gender binary and an assertion of masculine dominance took an especially strong hold during the decades around the 20th century. I also want to give another disclaimer that I am continuing to talk about trans men and that trans women have almost never, and I would say never, been accepted in the hierarchical hegemonic power. But my argument is that specifically white trans men have, in certain points in American history, been accepted and been applauded for their efforts, let's say. So this turn of the 20th century movement towards asserting masculinity, defining masculinity better, was tied with racial theories of white supremacy. And it has lasting effects on Americans' adherence to gender and sex binary. During the 1800s and early 1900s, Americans were obsessed with between masculinity, manhood, and racial dominance. In the face of rapid urbanization, post-Civil War Reconstruction, immigration, and a demand for more equal rights from various communities, white middle-class men actively worked to reinforce male power, and their race became a factor which was crucial to their gender. New explanations of why they as men were biologically worthy to wield power and authority was explained by connecting male power with white supremacy. So back to Susan Stryker, the wonderful trans historian. She says and argues quite well that one of the most powerful tools for social regulation, especially in this time period, was the rapid development of medical science. In her words, she says, since the end of the 18th century, science has gradually come to replace religion as the highest social authority. And since the middle of the 19th century, medical science has played an increasingly central role in defining everyday life. Medical practitioners and institutions have the power to determine what is considered sick or healthy, normal or pathological, sane or insane, and thus often to transform potentially neutral forms of human difference into unjust and oppressive social hierarchies. This particular operation of medicine's social power has been especially important in transgender history. So around the turn of the 20th century, scientists tried to identify advanced civilizations or so-called white supremacy by the degree of civilization's sexual differentiation. And at this time, there was no separation of sex and gender. So when I say sexual differentiation, this is also gendered behaviors as well. Civilized women were womanly, right? They were delicate, passive, religious, reared children, they were weak, these other, these stereotypes that we associate with true womanhood, right? They were firm of character. This was trying to be proved scientifically, right? To justify the separation of labor, to scientifically separate justification, let's say for voting rights even, right? That women were not capable of filling these roles biologically, and that this was a good thing. But this proved that civilization had reached a biological epoch, let's say. And I use this image as a classic gender sphere representation of a true man, a masculine man, and a true woman, right? Conversely, at the same time, we have social scientists trying to conflate savage or non-white men and women as being the same and identical in their sexual gender, both appearances and behaviors. Savage women, and I use savage in their words, savage women were aggressive, they carried heavy burdens, they did all sorts of masculine hard labor, these sorts of things. The pronounced sexual differences celebrated in the middle class's doctrine of separate spheres were assumed to be absent in savagery, but to be an intrinsic and necessary aspect of higher civilization. So these were used as justifications of racism and denying non-white Americans access to full citizenship. Through science and cultural hegemony, 19th century America weaponized science in pursuit of continually maintaining the power of white males. So-called racial scientists believe that the further from savagery a civilization moved, the more divergent gender differentiation became. In short, the creation and implementation of the gender binary in American culture came with specific racist hierarchical intentions that has lasted to this very day. When discussing trans rights in the context of American history, it is impossible to separate this connection. So here are some quotes from social scientists at the time talking about gender, right? Talking about sex and gender. We have Richard von Krafft-Ebing, who says the higher the development of the race, the stronger the contrast between men and women. We have William Thomas, the less civilized the race, the less is the physical differences of the sexes. We have Herbert Spencer, up from the lowest savagery, civilization has, among other results, caused an increasing exemption of women from breadwinning labor. And in the highest societies, they have become most restricted to domestic duties and the rearing of children. This image over here is just from a handbook that talks about phrenology, and often the unreliable women or the savage women are given over-exaggerated, caricaturized, often racialized features. So this all ties together. Let's see. I just lost my place. I'm sorry about that. All right. Yes. So let's talk about cross-dressing. So much like the reaction to other social movements and changes, an increase in cross-dressing laws in the mid and late 19th century can be interpreted as a reaction to an increase in urbanization and immigration in the United States. As the definitions of gender changed, it was first and foremost informed by definitions of race. As Western historian Peter Boag puts it, quote, clothing as manifestation and indication of gender was central to both the definition of sexual inversion and the identification of a sexual invert, which this term was used to describe both homosexual and trans behavior as one and the same, even though I believe these are completely separate. Thus, so-called cross-dressing took center stage in sexologist representation and medicalization of trans behavior during the last years of the 19th century. Laws that restricted what a person could culturally wear became the forerunner for what would be used to criminalize trans bodies out of public spheres, especially trans women. So historian Claire Sears, who wrote Resting Dress, Cross-Dressing, Law and Fascination in 19th Century San Francisco, has shown that that cross-dressing was far from a marginal practice, that it was a central component of 19th century urban life. It only emerged as peripheral when these laws were created. And these laws have immense effects and have produced definitions of gender normality and abnormality that haunt us to this day. And what's most interesting is that these laws first came out in anti-Chinese sentiment. Basically, they were trying to discriminate against the way Chinese immigrants were dressing. They claimed that they could not differentiate the sexes of Chinese immigrants, that the Chinese men had long hair, they wore loose silk clothes, and they were in feminized jobs such as laundry. And so it's interesting how we have these gendered laws that are actually, surprise, based in race first and foremost, based in the control of who is allowed to be in public, who is allowed to gain access to citizenship and civic life. Sears continues to say that cross-dressing laws extended beyond the policing of normative gender to impact the social meanings of city space, race, and citizenship. In particular, they crossed paths with federal immigration laws to limit the terms of national belonging and construct a gender normative nation. Far more than a local government order that created a misdemeanor offense, cross-dressing law represented a specific strategy of government that constructed normative gender, reinforced inequalities, and generated new modes of exclusion from public life. So, how does, let's see here, the new woman fit into all of this, right? This is happening at the same time. So concurrently, the middle-class women's movement was challenging past constructions of manhood by agitating for women's advancement. As they understood it, this meant that women wanted to participate in activities that were reserved for biological men, right? That these scientists and these men were claiming were only biologically possible for men to do. Such as citizenship, right? Voting rights, owning property, divorce abilities, these types of things, right? American men reacted passionately by ridiculing these new women, prophesying that they would make themselves ill, destroy national life, insisting that they were rebelling against nature. I use this photo. It's a satire of the new woman. It's showing sort of reversed gender roles. It's showing a silly standing, masculine standing woman smoking, looking with an aggressive face, and a man hunched over washing. There was this great fear that basically men would lose all of their power and women would replace them. And I included a little poem that was anonymously submitted to a journal in that time basically arguing that because women were fighting for more rights, that there would be no sex in the future. So why do I talk about the new woman in context to trans men? Well, the reason I do is because non-normative gender dressing was inherently tied with homosexuality, whether the people themselves were homosexual or not. It was this belief that if you wore, let's say you were assigned female at birth, you wore pants and you wanted to get a job, scientists at the time would accuse you of trying to physically become a man, to inhabit that role on a biological level, which they argued was not possible for a woman to do. So first wave feminism's success actually in gaining more rights undermined this assumption that education, professional status, and political power required a cis male body. The women's movement thus increased the pressure on middle-class men to reconfigure manhood. And this is where, again, race came to play an increasingly important role. So, if gender was so ideologically tied to race, what about trans individuals who lived in these times? So Emily Skidmore, who wrote True Sex, The Lives of Trans Men at the Turn of the 20th Century, she goes through and analyzes how newspapers interpreted the outing of trans men at this turn of the 20th century. And what she found was that there was, of course, as you can imagine, a distinct racial reaction to when trans men were outed. So queer bodies, as she says, could be rendered acceptable through an invocation of the positive values associated with normative US citizenship. So what I mean by that is white, and we'll talk about this a little bit in a second, but inhabiting these masculine roles perfectly. So passing, right? So this little quote at the bottom is actually something I came across in the Denver Post. It was talking about a man who had been outed when he went to the hospital as being trans, that he had deceived his community for 40 years. But it's interesting how newspapers, and this is what Emily Skidmore talks about, that newspapers at this time were actually sympathetic to white trans men. This quote, it's interesting, it says, "You'd be surprised by how little difference there really is to the unscientific eye between the masculine face and the feminine face. You think they are totally different because you always see the woman's face framed in a different setting of hair, ornaments, clothing, but shave the head or cover it with a wig and change the clothing entirely, and the face alone frequently reveals no secret of sex at all." So even these newspapers were starting to sort of deconstruct their own ideas that only cis male bodies can inhabit these roles. Only biological men can, right, wield citizenship and become a man, right? So these are some more newspapers I found. They're all from the Denver Post. That's just my own. I really like Colorado, so sometimes I can hyper focus on Colorado. But the stories of trans men and other gender transgressive figures, and this includes cross-dressers and women posing as men, but we would not consider them trans. They appeared with great frequency in popular press during the first decades of the 20th century. Such stories had wide appeal because they spoke to many of these same anxieties we were talking about: urbanization, immigration, equal rights. It transformed the ways that Americans lived, worked, and engaged with those around them. To many, these changes seem to threaten the stability of the nation because they challenge two of the most fundamental power structures of the US society: male dominance and white supremacy, like we've mentioned. So white trans men were often portrayed not as a freak of the new woman, but they were portrayed as embodying valor. It's very interesting, right? We often would imagine that human rights are linear, right? That the way people are treated is on a progressive upward trend. I argue, and other trans scholars are arguing, that this is not always the case. And I'm not arguing that in the 20th century, early 20th century, that trans men were accepted, more that they could sort of don certain hierarchical structures in order to be accepted. The newspapers would often portray white trans men as acting purely in their own interest, motivated by individual noble passions and their desire to serve one's country. there was little fear of them undermining the power structure of the US. Most of the positive stories were focused on individuals who excelled at embodying not simply masculinity, but a particular type of masculinity, that of the white, economically independent citizen. So it still fit into their idea, right? They said, oh, well, these clearly are men because they have jobs, they vote, they are married to women, they wear these clothes. Women are not capable of doing this. So it's this ironic acceptance that they're like, okay, they're really men because they're smart enough. They can do it, right? It's sexist. It's extremely sexist, but it's interesting how they were accepted in this way. Many of these white trans men were revealed to be college professors, soldiers, doctors, lawyers, ranchers, cowboys, miners, all of these sort of American masculine, stereotypical roles. As such, stories of white trans men became means through which national newspapers could extol the virtues of normative citizenship. So these individuals were so patriotic and hardworking that their personal drive was incompatible with the secondary status of womanhood, like I said. I'm skipping a bit just for time. Let me see. But on the other hand, we have trans men of color who were outed in this same time period. And these same newspapers, right off the bat, will use words like degeneracy, right? They will use key terms for the eugenics movement, right? That they were characterized as defective, heredity, and as savage, right? And they often associated them with crime, poverty, prostitution, intemperance, disease, these different ideas, chronic prisoners that they keep escaping and coming back to prison. Trans men of color were removed from history, right? They were not included in this valor, this white male valor, because they didn't fit into the Anglo-American superiority narrative. Let me go next here. So, let me go. Sorry, I'm on a different computer for my notes, so I keep losing my place. I'm very sorry about that. Yes. So I'm going back to cis women for the fact that they, in a sense, by pushing for more rights, undermined the very little rights that white trans men had at the same time. This is not an intentional thing. This is more, again, how the patriarchy perceives these behaviors. Through the early 1900s and into the 1920s, white cisgender women who never claimed to identify as men continued to push gender boundaries in the name of social equality, including what they wore. Trans men asserted their gender as men, lived the remainder of their lives as men, and participated in public civic life as men. The new woman, however, insisted that these privileges should be given to them without regard to gender or sex. Fictions of the public and private sphere being based on biological differences became harder and harder to maintain. The new complexity and restrictiveness of sex gender roles was epitomized by the flapper, which can be epitomized, as George Chauncey, an LGBT historian, says, that flappers were at once both sexually precocious and profoundly heterosexual. So this is helping to separate scientific ideas of trans behavior and sexuality as different, right? They're saying, oh, these are women who are wearing pants, they're getting jobs, they're voting, but they're not queer. They're still marrying, having children, and often returning to the home. And so how do we negotiate this trans behavior of so-called assigned women at birth donning male attire, right? So this led to a full identification of trans as its own category, and it garnered increased medical and legal scrutiny. Rather than seeing white trans men as real men because they dressed like men and had achieved so much, scientists now understood full well that women who identified as women could achieve these same things, and therefore they became more suspicious of trans men. Cisgender straight women who continually adopted more androgynous styles that became typical of the 1920s flapper belonged often to elite social and racial groups in America, and they could push the gender boundaries for what was publicly accepted. And this was seen as something that was avant-garde, artistic, right? And often there was not a question of their gender identity or sexuality or anything like this tied to it. They weren't called degenerate, right? And again, I'm speaking from a white perspective that in any cases where a person of color did these things, it was always continually described as degenerative, against civilization, these sorts of things. So some of these terms I have here, such as bulldyking in Harlem, the eroticization of the primitive, these were activities that happened in the 1920s where cis straight people would go to Harlem and witness the primitivism of Black performers. They would often go dressed up in drag because they believed that Harlem was this wide open primitive space where they could reject all of their civilization, right, and become primitive, become like trans themselves, right? But this is not an identity because they would take it off, go home, and return to their heteronormative lives. So, cis white women who still embodied feminine ideals and were heterosexual were permitted to experiment in different clothing styles, proving to sexologists that one did not have to change their gender in order to access some aspects of white male privilege. Trans men came under greater scrutiny during and after the 1920s as pathologically insane or racially degenerative because they insisted they were men, rather than just simply wanting to wear different gendered clothes, vote, or take part in public life like women now could, in still very oppressed ways. Unlike these new women who were still majorly mothers and homemakers, trans men insisted that they were still men. And so this was frustrating to scientists who could not really categorize them. So final thoughts would be my thesis, so to say, would be that the existence of trans-masculine individuals and masculine cross-dressing activities in early 20th century America offered a counter-ideology to define notions of racial and gender hierarchy through gendered patterns of dress and behavior, and proves that these hierarchies must constantly be asserted, defined, and maintained in order to exist. Individuals who were able to pass as male through dress and behavior were able to gain access to social and economic mobility that was withheld from them. In effect, their existence and sometimes acceptance proves that gender is a construct in relation to who and who cannot have access to hegemonic power and not an immovable biological fact. And as a last note, it's quite interesting, right? We see a large upswing in anti-trans sentiment, TERFs, the alt-right, and again, as is my thesis, you cannot separate racism from these topics. And it would be you'd be hard pressed to find a TERF, right, a trans exclusionary radical feminist who doesn't fall into the similar ideologies of racist alt-right groups, such things. So I'm at my time limit, but I just wanted to leave that final thought that history is not just some point in time that we can look at and go, yay, that's great, that it informs how we live and exist in our modern days, as we all know. Let me exit this. Thank you so much for listening to my presentation.